exactly how I did it. So, but to start, so it wasn't it wasn't what I would call a straight line, right? So, in fact, it wasn't a straight line at all. In fact, it was a very bumpy, curvy, lumpy, painful line. So it's it's July of 2017, and I have this like epiphany, and just don't laugh too hard when you hear me say this. I have this epiphany, and I realize, oh, okay, so like we shouldn't be, because when I came into the masonry restoration business, the method they were using to bid work was, and this is great. This is a 40-year-old company doing, the year before we had done my first year in the business. I'd come in June, and we had done about $1.7 million. So respectable revenue. And that was actually the best year ever that the company had ever had. So, so the way that they were bidding work is they would look at a wall and go, that's X amount of days. And so that's the way I was taught. And so I would take meticulous notes. I would show the owner and sometimes the other estimator, and I would get feedback from them. And that's how we would just go pick number of days and then multiply that times whatever the labor cost was, for however, and then, men and labor per man and so on and so forth. And then add the overhead and materials and equipment. Anyway, you got it. So, so it was, so I didn't know, I didn't know any better. So for 6 months, that's how I bid work. I would look at stuff and would basically kind of like, size it up, take really good pictures, show again the owner or the other estimator, and that's how I was bidding jobs. Then I, started asking more questions because, we were. We were not, things were not going well in the early part of 17. And so I started thinking like, maybe this isn't the best way. And our pricing was so inconsistent, right? Some jobs we would come in lower, some jobs higher. And so, for my brain that's kind of seeking some sort of an organized way of doing it, this was super chaotic. So I start talking to a friend of mine, and he's just a killer. He prices, I don't know, they do like $15-ish million in concrete a year, and he does all the pricing, and he's just a total boss, total killer. So I'm going to him going, hey, this, getting some feedback. And that's when I learned about production rates. So I thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So I started, so it's middle of 2017. I'm using that kind of system for the first time, where I'm using production rates and then going again, putting that against square footage, using so many men and adding laborers and all that stuff. And so starting to get organized, right? So the first job I really did this on was a school. It was a masonry restoration, and it was a public job, so it had blueprints and specs and all that fun stuff. And I had maybe I had bid one or two, but I hadn't done anything really substantial in terms of like using production rates to put against a square footage or lineal footage, measurement number. And then my dad gets sick, and I'm bidding this job. And so now I'm in the hospital with him all night. And the bid was due like literally the very next day at like 2:00 or something. So I'm bidding it throughout the night, which I actually did a lot, but I didn't usually do it in a hospital where my dad was like struggling to stay alive. So this story does not have a happy ending, because, usually someone tells a story like this and like, and I bid the job and we won the job and then we made $100,000. No, that's not what happened. We bid the job, we won the job, and then we paid $550, $580 to complete the job. And it was a $300,000. It was a $280,000 job. So that sucked. Along the way, I made the mistake of bidding a job we couldn't staff, so we didn't have the people for. So that job was, we had to hire, I want to say 3 or 4 men. One ended up having a huge workers' comp claim um, from a very minor injury that we handled very poorly, and learned the lesson of hiring people to fill a job that doesn't work. It's not going to go good. And it didn't, because none of those employees stayed with. In fact, I had to either they quit or we had to fire all of those guys. So um and then the job was also like 2 hours and 15, between 2 hours 15, 2 hours 30 from our shop. It was a total nightmare. But there was a seed in that, because even though I had royally blown the whole like production rate thing, because I got the production rates completely wrong, and then I didn't have the people, even if I had gotten them more right, I didn't have the people to do it. And, so it was just a disaster. But there was a seed in that. And I saw that, okay, there's a pattern here. And so I spent the next year and a half uh, developing these production rates, and like looking at our jobs and looking at like who we had on the job, talking to our senior people, and like really trying to get my arms around, okay, so when we're tuck pointing, standard size brick, which is the older stuff, the bigger bricks, what's our production rate per square foot per man per day? And then if we're doing stone, and if stone sometimes has like weird joints where some of them are raised and some of them are convex cave. Anyway, so there's different kinds of ways to strike the joint. And so I started getting really nerding out on that. And uh, it took a minute, but I mean, it took a better part of a year and a half to figure it out. But I saw there was a pattern, and I just had to figure out, like, if I could figure out that pattern, which was the production rates, our coverage rates on our material, and then making sure that we bid, priced, put our equipment in the right way, whether it was ours or whether we were renting. So I figured out those patterns for pricing, right? And then as I was figuring those out, I was also focused on our production too, because what I saw was there was a pattern. And so it wasn't just a pattern in pricing, there was a pattern overall in the business where things, you know, um, weren't working. Okay. And I'm actually going to share something. So as far as pattern recognition, maybe this will help a little bit. So let me find this real quick. Okay. So this is something that I got from, I've done Tony Robbins' Business Mastery twice now, twice in the last 5 or 6 years. I went in 17 actually, and then I just went in January of this year. And so quick plug for Business Mastery. I don't get paid anything on this, but it's just his work has changed my life so much in my business. So this is something that Tony goes through at Business Mastery, and that's where I picked it up. And it's actually straight from the workbook. And I'm going to show you something, because this is a pattern. That's why I pulled this up. And even though it's not exactly what we're talking about today, it's relevant. So this is the sort of life cycle or pattern that every business goes through. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter which country, it doesn't matter which jurisdiction, which state, it doesn't matter which industry. Every business is going to follow this. And that pattern is, let me zoom in a little bit so it's easier to see. So when you invest in a business, right, take on the risk, that's birth, right? And it's kind of like having a baby, right? I've got 3 children, and I remember I remember when they were born, and I remember it being amazing and being so excited, but they can't do anything, right? They couldn't feed themselves, they couldn't clean themselves. I mean, they needed help literally doing everything. So all you have, just like having a little infant, all you have is when you have a business with no customers, no revenue, something you've spent on or invested in, all you have really is pride of ownership, right? So most people watching this in this group are not, that's not where you are. And then of course there's, and that's, it's like sort of like infancy. As you go through that stage, it's really you. And then, you're kind of hustling to get some revenue, and then ideally hire someone so you can kind of like not be a one person army. All right. So here's where a lot of people fall. And this is where the business was that I took over. So the business, the Mason Restoration business was here. It was in the toddler phase, which is essentially management driven by crisis. So you're not really you're not really making like these proactive decisions about your business as much as your business is having, fires are starting every day, and you're just driving around or running around or getting on the phone with a big old hose and pointing the hose at the fire, trying to put out the fire. That's a toddler business. Some of the other things that that you see in a toddler business is that you don't have the money that you need, right? You don't have the credit and you don't have the cash. For the business, for the mason restoration business, this was an experience I'd never had, and I had started a wealth management business back in Chicago, with a partner. And but we were also reasonably well capitalized, so we had cash. So we didn't really have the same problems, and we had clients, we had recurring revenue. So anyway, I had never had to like chase customer payments to pay myself and my staff. That was a very, very new experience for me. And not only did we have to do that, but it was literally a bi-weekly thing. Like every other week, we were chasing, I mean, really all we were chasing money all the time, but especially like every payroll week was just like absolute survival. And I'll never forget that. And frankly, it's one of the things I'm the most grateful for, because one, it taught me to be very resourceful. Two, it taught me that you don't need all the stuff you think you need as far as expenses go. So I learned how to get lean, even with a business that, was doing 1.5 million and had at the time substantial overhead. So those are, so when you're in a toddler phase, you're not really running the business as much as the business is running you. And then there's teenager, and this is when things start to get fun. And this is a phase that I took the masonry business through, which is where, you know, you're sort of creating the crises because as the management or loaner or one of the leaders, you're creating the crises because you're bringing in a lot of sales, like you're bringing a lot of revenue in, and in contracting. So you got a lot of work and you've got a big backlog and you've got customers calling, when are you going to be on site? And you're trying to stay ahead of your materials orders and making sure that the jobs have equipment. And so it's like, it's, you're going out and getting a lot of business, and that business is creating a lot of challenges, right? So it's like a better version of, or a different version um, of the toddler, where so you're growing, you're doing a lot of revenue. So then here's what happens. So cash flow is a little bit better, right? That cash flow gets really good, but you're not making as much money on that on those sales, on that revenue. Jobs are performing better, but they're not like, it's not like you're not killing it and you're thinking we could still make a lot more money, right? So that's the teenager phase. And here's where the business, when I left the business, the Mason restoration business, here's where we were. We were kind of moving through this on to the next part, which is, young adult. So if you think about like like when you get into like your 20s, some of us who went to college, it's like you kind of like your junior year in college, or like if you think about your career, it's like maybe your second or third year, where you start to figure things out, and you realize like it's not so much about saying yes as it is about saying no, right? So one of the things I remember as a young adult, like, was I started realizing like I don't want to say, like, the more I say yes to, the more I obligate myself to, and the more like that's not really serving me. And so I think in young adulthood, you learn how to say no to stuff and how to get focused, which, saying no to things kind of keeps the like stuff you shouldn't be focusing on out of your periph, and like out of your, basically out of your field of vision, right? So it's about sharpening the focus, saying no, um, and then you kind of start thinking like, when you're going through toddler, it's just like you're just trying to get the next job, just trying to get the next deal, trying to get the next sale. When you go to, in a teenager, it's still about revenue, but it's about like, you're all of a sudden you're like, okay, let's work on this. You start fixing the business a little bit, but again, you create problems because you do new things and your staff's trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So it's really overwhelming for your employees. And then again, young adulthood is like when you start saying no. So that's a pattern. Um, so so what I saw with pricing was that so I saw the overall business, there was a pattern in the overall business. And that pattern was that the first thing we had to get right, so because we're getting a lot wrong. I also saw that like we weren't going to be able to fix everything right away. So I thought, okay, first of all, I got to triage this, right? I got to figure out like this patient will die if I don't intervene here. So let's figure out like what I need to do to save the patient's life first, right? Save the life first, then we can start figuring out what kind of quality life this patient's going to have. So that was kind of the approach I took. Was like, okay, there's 1,000 problems, but like I can really only work on just a few right now. So we got to stay alive. So that was the first thing. So, and to stay alive, you got, I mean, the first basic thing is you got to price jobs right, right? If you're not pricing your jobs right, you're effed. You're totally effed. You're not, you know, because then the work order goes out. If you even do a work order goes out. And then, you know, there are, you know, this is what happened. We would price it wrong. We had a crappy work order system and a crappy work order period. They'd get that. Our foreman would have a gazillion questions, as they should, and we didn't have good answers, right? Oftentimes the answer was, well, we might just have to do it. We would do work for free, like a lot, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of work was done for free. I mean, we wrote almost no change orders for like 2 years. So, um, so the first thing I triaged was pricing. So I saw that there's a pattern with production rates. So let's get these right for, I also saw that we did like six, really, there were six sort of like core parts of the business, or six um, types of work we did a lot, which was basically 3/4 of our business. It was cleaning, tuck pointing, replacement, brick and stone replacement, and caulking. And I can't believe I'm going to forget this. I'm not going to forget it. Caulking and, oh goodness, not lintel replacement. Oh man, I can't listen. It's escaping me. But anyway, so we had five core. That's crazy. I wrote anyway, whatever. So we had five core businesses. I just gave you four, and one that's not a core business with lentils. But anyway, which is, you know, steel. But anyway, so we had these five things that we did. And so what I did is I went and like tore them apart and like really focused on getting the rates right for those, getting our coverage rates right for the materials, and then making sure that we had the right equipment, and started building basically like my own pricing tool. And so that was a hot mess for a better part of a year. But then, you know, I started, you know, I kind of like I used Excel, and I kind of started putting these things and building databases in Excel, and, you know, I work in like, and I would look at jobs, and I would like note like, okay, this production rate's wrong. We need to lower or raise it. And I would be talking to my men. And so the problem was so none of this was centralized. So I was kind of sort of centralizing it, right? So I centralized production rates. I centralized the scopes of work, equipment, materials, you know, coverage rates, costs, unit costs, bulk costs, vendors that we used, and vendors that gave us the best pricing, and pricing by vendor. And like throughout 2019, I mean, I used this system for all of 2019. And that was the year that we turned it around, because we had some really great jobs that we got asked to bid. We won them. And then I used that system to win the jobs, and then, and to write our change orders. And so, um, after centralizing everything, like it was a lot easier then to manage. Like if we had if we had an increase in, you know, caulking price, for example, because we use this very good, very, you know, expensive commercial caulking to do like joints in the brick or stone, or windows, doors, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that stuff, that material, I mean, if you got it wrong, it could, you could, you know, you could eat, you know, 2 to 3% on that scope of work, and just on your gross profit. So in 2021, I implemented this thing that I was building across the entire business. So I put it into a, um, somewhat complex is if you when you tore it all apart, Excel spreadsheet, and I called it Tradesman Toolbox, and it had literally like everything we did. And then I would, as we got information, like when prices would change on a material or chemical or equipment or whatever. Like one year we had a lot of maintenance costs. Like in 21, we had a lot of maintenance costs. And so in 22, I had to raise what we charge for our equipment, right, to cover that. Anyway, um, doing that had a impact across the board because everybody was now using it, or for the most part using it. And so that just having that one thing, nailing our pricing in 2021 increased gross profit across the board by 6%. That's real. That's a real number. We were doing right around $4 million. And so, 6% of 4 million is 240,000. That was the impact of getting our pricing right. Okay. So the other challenge was production, right? So while I was working on pricing, I also got with I kind of had I had two guys that were our most senior foremen that, by the way, were also doing like 2/3 to 3/4 of our production, right? Two men, and they were great. They were both very experienced. They were both good producers themselves, but they also could run these big jobs. So I worked with them on how we could improve production. So the problem was that, you know, one, we weren't doing anything like in terms of like regular shop meetings. So there was none of that going on. Also, though, like we weren't communicating any standards, any systems. So I started putting together. So with this pricing system, we now had like a uniform way to do certain things. So I added a work order function. I added a change order function. I added a P&L function. So for the better part of my last 2 years, actually probably I was using it for 3 years, but I rolled it out in 21. So for 3 years, I had access to this, and for 2 years, my teams all had access to like where the jobs were performing. So, so I had a foreman daily, and so my men would fill out like the foreman daily, and that would go against the job. Like, and so I would see in real time. That actually wasn't until 2022, but like in 22, I could see real time where the job was performing based on, who was there, how long they were there, what we used that day, materials, and then what heavy equipment we had on the job. So, um, so by focusing on those two P's, pricing and production, by really nailing those for the first, like in 19 and 20, as we were kind of turning things around, like that kind of put us on a different trajectory, right? So, so you know, I got the pricing part right first, right? And then while that as that got better, as I got momentum with that, we got more jobs. We went from doing 1.5, 1.7 in 2016 to then we did less the next year. We did 2.2 in 18, but still lost money. And then we did 3.8, 4.7, and like 4 in 21, and then we did 3 in 22. So, and that was actually a really rough year, 22. So, so, I took the fact. So once we had jobs and once we had like a big backlog, then I was able to pivot and start looking at production. And so we went from having no uniform way to do things to, I put in like an informal training system, or like an informal, what do I call that? It wasn't mentor, but I called it like an informal apprenticeship. That's how that escaped me. But so where I would like take a younger man, like one of our younger men that wanted to learn how to be a mason. And so, we had like a couple of brick tenders that had come from the union that didn't want to be in a union shop because we were open shop. So, and then I would rotate them. So from 20, so it was 2021. Yeah. So for 3 years, I would take these guys and I would rotate them with different senior foremen. And, that was extremely beneficial. And so after 3 years, the guys that started out like and had gone through this sort of informal apprenticeship, they were actually very good, right? And they were actually producing like a young mason should, right? In terms of like their quality and speed. So we did things like that. So we really focused on pricing and production first. And then once we had like a machine where I knew that like we could take down, um, I didn't pick my nose there. That was me scratching. I knew we could take down, I don't know what our limit would have been, but like a multi-million dollar, we could do multi-million dollar, multi-year commercial historical restoration projects, and we could do them really well because we did that we kind of cut our teeth. I mean, the company was already good at those as far as like understood them. We weren't making a lot of money, but they understood them and they could perform the work, and the work looked pretty good. Um, so I knew we could roll up on any job, within our, within sort of like our then defined market, and we could perform the job, right? We had we had the manpower, we had the skill as far as doing complex stuff and doing it really well. We could do stuff at substantial height. We would go up. This one job we did was this huge cathedral with almost 300 feet in the air, and scaffolded, and we executed that. It was actually one of the most profitable jobs the company had ever done. And that was one of my multi-year jobs. So, once we did that, then I looked at, once we got the pricing thing figured out, then I started really focusing on who our ideal customer was. And then once we figured that out, like because you get all these job leads, right? And I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just kind of teeing up the next live, because I'll be talking about this next week. But you get all these leads, and so how do you know which ones to go on, right? Well, I came up, I developed a very specific, target as far as who we wanted to do business with, and then everything outside of that was a hard no all the time. No, I mean, if it didn't match like that was in that box, we didn't do it. Period. Full stop. So, and then once we figured that out, then we started working on, then I tackled, our people, making sure we had the right people. And, we dismissed some folks, and we did some hiring, and that's, kind of what I had done up until, leaving last December. So there's a pattern, right? And that's the thing that I want to impress today on you, is that like, you know, these things that, you know, these things that go wrong or go right are going right for a reason. If we can figure out what that reason is, again, why they're going wrong, why they're going right, then we've got, that's going to help us to do more of the stuff that's producing and do less of the stuff that's not producing. And I realize that someone's watching this going, no shit. Like, yeah, but it's one thing to like know it. Like, I know it in here. It's another thing to know it in my experience. I knew that intellectually, but I didn't know it like in my experience until I went through something where we was like produce or die, like do or die. You must succeed or you will fail. So the pattern was pricing and production. And then it was customers, right? Getting the right customer. And then it was employees or people, talent. So we did the first thing, and then we went on to do the second thing. I'm going to talk about the other things next week and the following week, but I want to help, because again, you might be watching this going, well, Adrian, we're doing 3 million, or we're doing 4 million, or we're doing 5, or we're even doing 10. And I know, because I haven't done 10 million yet, but I have like good friends that are doing that right now. And, and we've got folks in here that, that we're working with that are doing, between 8, 10, 15, 20, experiencing some of the same problems, right? Because just because you get to just because you get to 8 figures or get to strong 8 figures doesn't mean that it's going smoothly, right? Doesn't mean that there's not challenges. And again, we see that, like I said, I came into this business that was 40 years old, and credit to the owner for surviving. I mean, seriously, because there's like a 94% failure rate, I think, if you go at 20 years or 30 years for small businesses. So it's a very, very high failure rate. And he survived and had a lot of customers that just loved him, right? But it was just surviving. So We're going to talk more about the other two things, the other two patterns next week and the following week, again, which are um, target customer, and because I've we've talked about that a little bit, but I'm going to spend more time on that, and then also about like people, right, and about picking the right people. And actually, we've got a hiring thing going on, so we've got I think we're giving our mini course away for free right now. So check that if you want that. That's just comment on this or comment early on any post, and one of our team will zip that over to you. So thanks for hanging out with me. I'm here every Monday at noon Eastern time. Jay and I go live every Friday at 3 Eastern time, where we talk about similar stuff, but also kind of get like into the weeds on some of these things. As far as we talked about subcontractors last week, we've talked a lot about hiring and managing project delays. And, we talk about the things that we had to figure out. I had to, he had to, and two, things that like also led to substantial profits. Because I don't know if I've even said this, but I mean, the mason restoration business, I mean, went from, essentially like, I mean, on a net basis, losing money over like 10, 12 years before I got there, to our margins were between 20 and 30%. So, I mean, we were literally a money printing machine in my last, 4 years in the business. So anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. I'm back next Monday, 12 noon. And like I said, Jay and I go live at 3 o'clock, um, 3 o'clock on Friday. Um, any comments, anything you want, anything you want to say, drop a comment. I try to get to those and respond to them as quickly as I can see them. And if there's something you want to hear about, like drop a comment for that. And if I can work it in, I'll work it in. So anyway, thanks everybody. And we'll